The smallest piece of iron on my ranch was about to cost the homeowners association more than they could ever imagine. The first sound that reached me that morning was not birds singing across the pasture or cattle moving toward the feed trough. It was the heavy rumble of a bulldozer engine idling just beyond my old red barn. The vibration traveled through the dry Texas soil and into the soles of my worn leather boots, while the smell of diesel mixed with fresh-cut hay and weathered oak that had absorbed decades of blazing summer heat. Bright orange survey flags stretched across my pasture like someone had quietly decided my family's history ended at sunrise. A crew of contractors stood beside the machine, holding coffee cups and clipboards, avoiding eye contact as though they already knew they were standing in the wrong place. One man finally cleared his throat and looked in my direction. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "we are waiting for final authorization." I did not answer him. My attention drifted toward something almost completely hidden beneath a patch of brittle grass near the corner of the barn. A rusted iron survey marker barely peeked through the dirt, untouched by time, unnoticed by everyone standing around it. They were all staring at the barn. I was staring at the only object that still remembered where this land truly began. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 41 years old, and everything you see on this ranch was built long before Willow Creek Estates existed. My grandfather raised this barn with his own hands, hauling rough-cut timber across this property when the nearest paved road was still miles away. My father replaced the roof after a brutal hailstorm and taught me that every fence post, every gate, and every survey marker deserved more respect than any speech delivered in a boardroom. I believed him then, and I believed him even more while watching a machine wait for permission to erase 4 generations of honest work. 3 weeks earlier, a certified envelope had arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a notice informing me that the Homeowners Association had fined me $48,000 because my barn supposedly violated newly enforced setback regulations. According to their survey, part of the building rested on association property instead of my own land. They included a polished color map with thick red boundary lines, legal language, payment deadlines, and warnings that additional penalties would continue until the structure was removed or I surrendered the disputed section of my ranch. I remember laying that letter beside my father's old leatherwork gloves on the kitchen table. The paper smelled like fresh ink and expensive stationery, but something about it never felt right. Buildings do not quietly slide across property lines after standing in the exact same place for almost 40 years. Land does not forget where it belongs simply because someone prints a newer map. Yet every official document carried the same confident conclusion, and every conversation ended with someone telling me I should simply give in before the situation became more expensive. Standing there beside my barn with the rising sun reflecting across its faded metal roof, I realized everyone believed this story was about a building. They could not have been more mistaken. It was never about the barn. It was about proving whether truth still mattered when authority insisted it had already made up its mind. Long before anyone accused that barn of standing in the wrong place, it was simply the center of my family's life. My grandfather, Harold Walker, built it in the early 1980s after saving for years to buy enough timber to replace an aging equipment shed that had finally given in to time. He never hired a construction crew. Every beam was lifted by family, every nail driven by hands that believed hard work left behind something worth remembering. My father used to tell me that you could read our family's history just by walking through those old wooden doors. The deep grooves worn into the floor came from tractors that had worked the same fields for decades. The faded marks along one wall came from the first livestock trailer he ever owned. Even the smell inside the barn never really changed. Fresh hay mixed with old pine boards, machine oil, leather saddles, and the faint scent of rain trapped inside weathered wood after every Texas storm. I grew up believing that smell meant home. Every Saturday morning began before sunrise. My father poured black coffee into a dented metal mug while I struggled to pull on oversized work boots that always seemed one size too big. We repaired fences, stacked square hay bales, cleaned equipment, and checked every corner of the property before breakfast. He never wasted words, but every lesson stayed with me. If something broke, you fixed it. If someone questioned your honesty, you answered with facts instead of anger. And if there was ever confusion about where your land ended, you trusted the original survey before trusting anyone's opinion. At the time, I thought he was simply teaching me how to care for a ranch. Years later, I realized he had been preparing me for a fight neither of us could have imagined. After graduating from college, I spent nearly 15 years working as a civil engineer, designing bridges, drainage systems, and public infrastructure across Texas. I enjoyed the work, but every project reminded me how much I missed home. When my father passed away, returning to the ranch stopped feeling like a choice. It became a responsibility. Some people thought I had walked away from a successful career. I never saw it that way. I came back to protect something far more valuable than an office title. Every evening after finishing the day's work, I locked the heavy iron latch on the barn door and looked across the pasture exactly the way my father always had. Nothing about this place felt temporary. The barn had survived droughts, hailstorms, powerful winds, and changing generations without moving so much as an inch. That is why the survey enclosed with the Homeowners Association notice never made sense to me. According to their colorful map, my family's barn had somehow crossed onto land that supposedly belonged to the association. I spread the documents across my kitchen table beside faded family photographs, old deeds, and my father's worn leather gloves. The measurements looked clean. The legal language sounded convincing. But every memory I carried told a different story. Buildings do not quietly wander across a pasture after standing in the same place for 4 decades. Somewhere between the paper in front of me and the ground beneath my boots, the truth had been misplaced, and I had a feeling the land itself was waiting to show me exactly where it had been hidden. The woman behind every certified letter was Linda Prescott, the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. She had a way of speaking that sounded polite until you realized every sentence carried an expectation disguised as a suggestion. Before leading the association, she had built a successful career selling upscale suburban homes, and she proudly believed appearance was just as valuable as ownership. Perfect lawns, matching fences, freshly painted mailboxes, and carefully trimmed hedges were more than neighborhood standards to her. They were proof that she was protecting property values. My old ranch did not fit that picture anymore. Years earlier, open pasture separated my family land from the subdivision. Then developers arrived. One field became 20 homes. Another pasture turned into winding streets lined with decorative trees and stone entrance signs. Families moved in, children rode bicycles down sidewalks, and suddenly my weathered red barn could be seen from the newest section of Willow Creek Estates. I never complained about the growth. People had every right to build homes beside my ranch. I only expected the same respect for land that had belonged to my family long before those streets ever existed. My first conversation with Linda happened shortly after I moved back permanently. She drove onto the property in a spotless white sport utility vehicle carrying a welcome basket and a smile that seemed perfectly rehearsed. She complimented the view, admired the old oak trees, and casually mentioned that the community hoped neighboring properties would maintain an appearance consistent with modern residential expectations. I thanked her for stopping by, accepted the basket, and thought nothing more about it. Looking back now, I realized she had spent that visit studying my property instead of welcoming me home. A few months later, the letters began arriving. The first suggested cosmetic improvements to the barn because it was visible from newer homes. The second encouraged replacing sections of my traditional fencing with materials that better reflected neighborhood aesthetics. Then came another notice questioning the appearance of agricultural equipment parked beside the barn. Every letter sounded courteous, but every request pushed a little farther than the one before it. I answered every concern respectfully. Whenever possible, I included county permits, photographs, and property records showing that my ranch operated legally and had existed decades before the subdivision. Weeks passed without another response, and I believed common sense had finally prevailed. Then the invitation to attend the monthly board meeting arrived. The community clubhouse smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee when I walked inside. Framed photographs of award-winning landscaping covered the walls while neatly arranged chairs faced a large projection screen. Linda greeted everyone with practiced confidence before displaying an aerial map of the neighborhood. When my ranch appeared on the screen, she picked up a laser pointer and traced a bright red boundary line straight through my pasture. According to a newly commissioned survey, she explained, part of my family's barn occupied association property. Several board members quietly nodded while flipping through prepared documents as though the conclusion had already been accepted before I entered the room. I asked one simple question. What happened to every county survey recorded before your subdivision existed? Linda smiled politely and replied that updated professional measurements reflected the current understanding of the property boundary. The room grew quiet. I looked at the colorful map projected across the wall, then remembered every lesson my father had taught me about land, history, and original survey markers. For the first time, I realized this was never going to end with a conversation. The pressure did not explode overnight. It settled over my ranch one quiet day at a time until every ordinary chore seemed to carry the weight of another deadline. 2 mornings after the board meeting, I stepped outside with a bucket of feed and immediately noticed bright orange paint sprayed across the grass beside my barn. Thin wooden stakes connected by fluorescent strings stretched across the pasture in a perfectly straight line, cutting through the land as though someone had already decided the argument was over. The sharp smell of fresh marking paint drifted through the cool morning air while dew still clung to the grass. It felt less like a survey and more like a declaration. Before lunch, a white pickup truck carrying the logo of a local construction company rolled slowly into my driveway. 3 men climbed out carrying measuring wheels, clipboards, and rolled construction plans. They were respectful, almost uncomfortable, explaining they had only been asked to prepare removal estimates if enforcement moved forward. One of them quietly admitted that no final order had been issued yet, but the association wanted cost projections ready in advance. Hearing those words while standing beside the barn my grandfather had built left an emptiness I had never experienced before. Complete strangers were calculating the price of erasing 4 generations of family history before anyone had even proven the land belonged to someone else. The following days became even heavier. A notice appeared on the community website describing an active property compliance issue involving agricultural structures near the eastern boundary of Willow Creek Estates. My address was never listed, but everyone in the area knew exactly which property the notice referred to. Neighbors who had waved at me for years suddenly slowed their vehicles near my fence before quietly driving away. At the feed store, one man suggested I should settle before legal costs became overwhelming. Another shook his head and said nobody ever really won against a determined homeowners association because they always had more attorneys than ordinary homeowners. Even the county clerk could offer little reassurance. When I requested copies of every recorded survey connected to my property, she politely explained that the newest documents appeared complete and properly filed. She was kind, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Official paperwork tends to carry its own momentum, especially when nobody questions the measurements behind it. Every afternoon, another certified envelope seemed to appear inside my mailbox. One warned about additional daily penalties. Another outlined the possibility of liens against my property if payment deadlines passed. I pinned every notice above the old workbench inside the barn beside faded photographs of my father and grandfather. The bright white paper looked strangely out of place against rough wooden walls darkened by decades of honest work. Late one evening, I walked the fence line alone, following the same route my father always took whenever he needed to think. Dry grass brushed against my boots while cicadas buzzed from the oak trees overhead, and a warm breeze carried the familiar scent of hay across the pasture. Every few yards I stopped to compare the colorful survey map with the actual land beneath my feet. The drawings insisted one story. The landscape quietly insisted another. As the last light of sunset faded across the weathered barn roof, I found myself standing near an overgrown corner of the pasture where my father had once paused to tell me that the oldest answers were usually buried beneath the newest mistakes. At the time, I never understood what he meant. Standing there in the gathering silence, I began to wonder whether the land itself had been waiting patiently for me to remember. By the beginning of the second week, I accepted something I had been trying to avoid. I could not untangle this alone. I scheduled a meeting with a local real estate attorney whose office overlooked the county courthouse. Shelves filled with thick legal volumes lined the walls, and the faint smell of old paper mixed with polished oak filled the quiet conference room. I spread everything I owned across his large table. Original property deeds, county tax records, insurance documents, faded family photographs, engineering sketches, and every certified letter the Homeowners Association had mailed me over the past month. He studied each page without rushing, occasionally comparing an older deed to the newly filed survey, before making careful notes in the margin of a yellow legal pad. The only sound in the room was the slow turning of paper and the steady ticking of an old wall clock. After nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your ownership records are consistent," he said calmly. "The problem is that their survey also appears professionally prepared." Those words settled over the room like heavy dust. He explained that judges generally rely on licensed survey reports unless another licensed survey supported by stronger evidence proves otherwise. Simply believing the boundary had been misplaced would never be enough. We needed measurable facts tied to the land itself. Original monuments, historical benchmarks, county control points, something physical that could not be argued away by polished presentations or expensive paperwork. I thanked him, gathered my documents, and drove home with more questions than answers. The warm Texas wind drifted through the open truck windows, carrying the scent of dry grass across the highway, but nothing cleared the growing weight in my mind. Every mile reminded me that the bulldozer was still waiting beyond my pasture, and every passing fence line reminded me how easily paper could convince people to doubt something that had never moved. Another certified envelope greeted me inside the mailbox that afternoon. This notice repeated the payment demand and warned that additional penalties would continue accumulating if I failed to comply before the stated deadline. I carried it into the barn and pinned it beside the others above my old workbench. The crisp, white envelopes looked strangely fragile against rough wooden boards that had survived decades of storms without complaint. As evening settled over the ranch, I walked the eastern fence line the same way my father always had after finishing a long day's work. Cicadas filled the air with their steady chorus while the last rays of sunlight reflected softly from the faded metal roof above the barn. I stopped every few yards to compare the printed survey with the actual shape of the pasture. The lines on paper insisted one version of reality. The land beneath my boots quietly insisted another. Near an overgrown corner where tall grass had grown untouched for years, my boot struck something solid hidden beneath the soil. I knelt instinctively and brushed away loose dirt with my hand. The edge of cold metal appeared beneath the grass. For a moment, I simply stared at it while an old memory returned with remarkable clarity. I could almost hear my father's voice saying, "Paper can be rewritten, Ethan, but the first survey marker tells the same story forever." As the evening breeze stirred the grass around my knees, I realized I might finally be looking at the one witness that had never forgotten where the truth began. The piece of metal was barely visible beneath years of packed soil, tangled grass, and dried leaves, but the moment I cleared away the dirt with my fingertips, I knew exactly what I had found. It was an original survey monument. The square iron cap was dark with rust, its edges softened by decades of rain, wind, and relentless Texas summers, yet faint stamped markings still remained beneath the layer of dirt. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Something about seeing that old marker brought an unexpected sense of calm. It had been sitting there through every season, every storm, every ownership change around it, quietly waiting for someone to notice it again. I reached for my phone and carefully photographed the marker from every angle before comparing its position with the survey map that the Homeowners Association had relied upon. The more I measured by eye, the less the drawing made sense. According to their documents, this monument should not have been there at all. Early the next morning, I contacted Daniel Brooks, a licensed land surveyor whose family had spent 3 generations surveying ranches and farms across Texas. His voice remained calm as I described what I had found. After a brief pause, he asked only one question. "Has anyone disturbed that monument?" I told him I had not moved it. "Good," he replied. "Leave everything exactly where it is. I will be there this afternoon." Daniel arrived in an older white pickup loaded with professional survey equipment, aluminum tripods, satellite positioning, receivers, measuring poles, weatherproof instrument cases, and field notebooks worn smooth from years of use. He stepped quietly across the pasture, crouched beside the monument, brushed away another thin layer of dirt with a small nylon brush, and studied it without speaking. The only sounds came from distant cattle, the breeze moving through the tall grass, and the occasional electronic tone from his equipment as satellites locked into position overhead. Nearly an hour passed before he finally stood up. "This monument predates the subdivision," he said. "It is tied directly to the original county control network." We spent the remainder of the afternoon measuring every corner of my pasture. Daniel verified each coordinate several times using different reference points before comparing the results against historical county plats, original property deeds, engineering benchmarks, and archived aerial photographs dating back decades. As the layers of evidence slowly came together, a remarkable pattern emerged. Every historical record agreed with the monument buried beneath my pasture. Every fence line built by my grandfather aligned naturally with those measurements. Even the old drainage ditch followed the same original boundary. Only the newer survey commissioned by the Homeowners Association drifted several feet away from every historical reference. As golden sunlight settled across the weathered roof of my barn, Daniel unfolded transparent overlays across the tailgate of his truck. One by one, he placed aerial photographs from different decades over the modern survey until the differences became impossible to ignore. He gently tapped the rusted monument with the toe of his boot before looking at me with the quiet confidence of a man who trusted evidence more than opinions. "This little piece of iron has been telling the truth for decades," he said. "Someone simply chose to measure from the wrong place." For the first time since that certified envelope arrived in my mailbox, I stopped wondering whether I could save my family's barn. I realized the land had already preserved the truth. All I needed to do was let it speak. Daniel Brooks did not rush to contact the county or send dramatic letters to the Homeowners Association. That alone told me I had hired the right surveyor. He believed facts carried more weight when they were impossible to challenge. Over the next several days, we treated my ranch like a professional engineering project instead of an emotional dispute. Every corner of the property was measured multiple times using satellite positioning equipment, total stations, historical control points, and traditional field methods. The steady electronic beeps from the survey instruments echoed across the quiet pasture, while the smell of sun-warmed cedar drifted through the afternoon air. Every measurement was recorded, verified, and repeated from different reference locations before Daniel accepted it as accurate. We launched a small drone to capture detailed aerial photographs of the entire ranch, then compared those images with archived county aerial surveys dating back decades. One transparent overlay after another settled neatly into place across the tailgate of his truck. Fence lines matched perfectly. The old gravel driveway aligned exactly with historical maps. The drainage ditch my grandfather had dug years ago followed the same legal boundary shown in county records. Even the weathered barn sat precisely where every original document placed it. Only one set of measurements refused to agree with everything else. The survey commissioned by the Homeowners Association drifted several feet away from every historical reference once it was tied back to the original monument. Daniel quietly explained that small surveying errors could become significant when modern reference points replaced original control monuments. In this case, one incorrect starting point had shifted an entire property line on paper. My attorney visited the ranch later that week to review the growing collection of evidence. He slowly turned the pages inside Daniel's report before laying them beside the original deeds, certified county plats, engineering benchmarks, archived aerial photographs, and tax parcel records. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I saw genuine confidence on his face. He tapped the thick binder once and smiled. "Now we are not arguing," he said. "Now we are proving." We immediately requested a formal county hearing before any enforcement action could continue. The Homeowners Association responded with another polished letter insisting that its licensed survey remained valid and expressing complete confidence that the matter would soon be resolved. Reading those words no longer bothered me. Linda Prescott still believed this dispute depended on authority, deadlines, and confidence. She had no idea the land itself had already chosen a side decades before either of us ever became involved. During the days leading to the hearing, I stopped responding to rumors, online comments, and additional notices arriving in my mailbox. Every evening, I simply walked through the barn, closed the heavy iron latch with its familiar metallic click, and watched the last light settle across the pasture exactly as it had throughout my childhood. The contractors parked beyond my fence gradually became part of the scenery, convinced they would soon receive permission to begin work. Meanwhile, Daniel continued refining every map, every coordinate, and every supporting document until the evidence fit together with remarkable precision. Looking across the kitchen table the night before the hearing, I no longer saw scattered paperwork. I saw one complete story told by original deeds, historical records, careful measurements, and a forgotten iron monument that had remained patiently beneath the grass while everyone else argued above it. The truth had already been measured long before this dispute ever began. Tomorrow, all we had to do was place it in front of the people willing to listen. The county hearing room felt almost too quiet for a dispute that had consumed so many weeks of my life. Soft fluorescent lights reflected across polished tile floors while the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted from a small table near the entrance. Linda Prescott arrived carrying a thick leather binder filled with neatly organized documents, followed by several homeowners association board members and their attorney. Their confidence filled the room before anyone spoke a single word. They greeted one another with relaxed smiles, arranged color maps across the conference table, and quietly discussed what sounded less like a hearing and more like a routine formality. Across the room, Daniel Brooks placed one weathered field case beside his chair and carefully arranged only a handful of binders in front of him. He did not seem interested in making an impression. He looked like a man who trusted measurements more than appearances. When the hearing officially began, the association presented its case first. Enlarged survey maps appeared on a display screen showing bright property lines, setback measurements, and professional certification stamps. Linda calmly explained that the board had acted responsibly to protect common property and preserve neighborhood standards. Every page looked polished. Every sentence sounded carefully prepared. Listening without context, most people would probably have believed the matter had already been settled. Then Daniel quietly stood and carried the original iron survey monument to the front of the room. He placed it gently beside the historical county plats before displaying aerial photographs taken decades apart, original property deeds, engineering benchmarks, satellite measurements, tax parcel overlays, and the field survey completed across my ranch. Instead of asking anyone to believe him, he simply connected each document to the next until every independent record pointed toward exactly the same property boundary. Finally, he overlaid the Homeowners Association survey on top of the historical records. For the first time that morning, complete silence settled across the room. The hearing officer leaned forward, studying every measurement before looking toward the association's survey consultant. "Can you explain why your boundary does not reconcile with the original monument, the county control benchmark, the historical plats, or the recorded deeds?" Nobody answered immediately. Linda glanced toward her attorney before the survey consultant slowly admitted that the original monument had not been incorporated into the newer survey. Instead, the survey had relied upon more recent subdivision reference points, established years after the original ranch boundaries had already been legally recorded. Daniel calmly explained how beginning from the wrong control point shifted every subsequent measurement several feet away from its lawful position. The hearing officer requested a short recess to review the complete record. When everyone returned, the written findings were direct and unmistakable. The enforcement action was dismissed. Every assessed fine was withdrawn. The proposed boundary claim was rejected because the overwhelming weight of historical evidence supported the original monument and the long-standing county records. The officer further recommended that the association obtain a corrected survey before attempting any future enforcement involving surrounding properties. Linda remained perfectly still while the decision was read. The certainty she had carried into the hearing quietly disappeared without raised voices, arguments, or dramatic speeches. Outside the courthouse, warm Texas sunlight reflected across the parking lot as I stood beside my truck, holding the same folder of family records I had carried from the beginning. Nothing inside those pages had changed. The land had never changed either. Only the mistaken story built around it had finally come apart when the truth was measured from the place where it had always been waiting. When I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The bulldozer was gone. The contractors had packed their equipment, the orange survey stakes had disappeared, and the only tire tracks left across the pasture were already beginning to soften beneath the Texas wind. I stepped out of my truck and stood for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds I had almost forgotten during the past several weeks. Cattle moved slowly through the field. A light breeze rustled the oak leaves above the barn. Somewhere beyond the fence, a meadowlark sang the same tune I had heard since I was a boy. Nothing about the ranch felt different, yet everything had changed. A few days later, an official letter arrived from the Homeowners Association confirming that every fine had been withdrawn and that all enforcement actions against my property had been permanently canceled. The board also announced it would commission an independent review of several surrounding property boundaries to ensure future records accurately reflected the original county surveys. It turned out my ranch was not the only place affected by the incorrect measurements. Several common area maps required revisions, and future development plans had to be updated before moving forward. The mistake that had nearly cost me my family's barn ended up forcing the entire neighborhood to return to the original records that had been quietly waiting all along. Linda Prescott remained noticeably quieter after the hearing. She attended board meetings, but homeowners who had once accepted every recommendation without question began asking to review documents before approving new projects. Survey reports were examined more carefully. Property records were verified instead of assumed. Nobody celebrated anyone's embarrassment. They simply expected greater accuracy, and that small change made the entire community stronger. As for me, life slowly returned to the rhythm my father would have recognized. Every morning began with a cup of black coffee on the porch before the sun climbed above the pasture. Every evening ended with the familiar metallic click of the heavy iron latch closing the barn door. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel Brooks stopped by while passing through the area. Together we walked back to the original survey monument, carefully cleaned the remaining dirt from its weathered surface, and installed a simple protective marker nearby, so nobody would accidentally disturb it again. The old piece of iron looked almost ordinary beneath the afternoon sunlight, but I understood something now that I had never fully appreciated before. Truth rarely announces itself. It waits patiently beneath the surface until someone is willing to uncover it. I rested my hand against one of the old oak support beams inside the barn and thought about my grandfather lifting those timbers into place decades earlier. I thought about my father reminding me that land remembers every honest measurement. He was right. Long after confident opinions fade, legal arguments end, and fresh ink dries on new paperwork, the facts remain exactly where they have always been. Every time I walk past that quiet corner of the pasture, I still glance toward the survey monument hidden beneath the grass. It reminds me that real justice does not depend on who speaks the loudest or who holds the most authority. Sometimes justice is nothing more than a forgotten piece of iron, an honest measurement, and the patience to let the truth stand exactly where it has always belonged.